But thank you all so much for joining us for Author Hour in Massachusetts with author Elizabeth Harris. New York Times award-winning book reporter and author Elizabeth Harris will discuss her debut novel, How to Sleep at Night, a funny story of family, marriage, love, and politics in this latest installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Elizabeth Harris is an award-winning reporter at the New York Times, where she covers books and the publishing industry. She lives in New York City with her wife and kids. And this novel, How to Sleep at Night, is her debut novel. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's jump right into it, Elizabeth. Can you tell the viewers, those watching live and those watching the recording, what your book is about?
Absolutely. So the book is about marriage and ambition and what happens when who we are in the world doesn't match how we see ourselves. The book follows a woman who's become a stay-at-home mom by accident, and it's a terrible fit for her. And she feels like an accessory in her husband's life. There's a woman whose career is her entire world, but it's a job she's come to dread and resent. And then there are two men who are married. One is a Democrat, one is a Republican. And as the book begins, the Republican decides to run for office.
So, Elizabeth, how common? So, first of all, I finished your book this morning. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun with a lot of funny moments.
Thank you.
And yeah, yeah. But it did get me thinking a lot about like our state of politics in America right now. And I'm curious if you did any research, any indication of how common it is nowadays in the year 2025, where you have spouses that are of opposing political viewpoints. You know, how these, mixed political party marriages, if you will. I'm not sure what the proper term is, but, is this must be becoming more rarer and rarer in the year 2025.
I don't know what the numbers are. I bet you someone has researched this, sort of how it's changed over time. I don't know, but I would agree with you that it's probably becoming rarer. But one way I did do research for this book is there are a number of, I guess, politically mixed, shall we call them, couples in my own extended family. And they've been together 15 years, 20 years, 45 years. And I don't think it's ever been anyone's favorite thing about their relationship, but it was more kind of sort of an annoyance that flared around election seasons. But over the past 10 years or so, it has become harder and trickier for them to navigate. But they're all still married and actually happily so. So that was kind of one of the places where the book started, actually, is just sort of seeing this happen and just thinking like, how do they do that? Right? Um, and that was kind of the first germ. And then, from there one day I started thinking like, God, it would be terrible if one of them ran for office. It would be terrible if one of them ran for office. Wow, how interesting. And sort of what would be so hard about that? I don't think anyone would be like excited about that. But like, what is it that would be so stressful? And I think the kind of two things that kind of came to mind for me were that it would you would be you would become famous basically for these political views you despise, and then also kind of you'd have to figure out for yourself like where is the line, like how much can I support my spouse while still kind of not selling out my own values. And then from there I kind of spun it wider and tried to think of like what are some other ways we can lose the thread of our own story. um, and so yeah, so I mean, as research for this, I had a lot of conversations with my own family members, essentially. And I would say my hunch would be that it would be more of an impediment if they were getting together now. Like these people have all been together for quite a long time, but they do manage. And that was something that kind of in the course of kind of researching this book and thinking about this. I mean, this is obviously a really really fraught time. And it wouldn't work for everyone, but it did give me a little hope of just sort of on the personal level that people are able to do this, like regardless of what you think of somebody else's leader, but sort of on a just kind of person to person basis, that is still possible and people are still doing it. So.
Sure. And in the case of Ethan and Gabe, your two of your main characters, Ethan was a Democrat. When my understanding, if I remember the timeline correctly, is Gabe and Ethan were both Democrats, and then Ethan became a Republican. Once after they got married. So that's a little bit of a difference there as well. So you talked about a little bit about the research that you did for the book. You talked a little bit about the reason, the sort of the premise behind it, why you decided to write it. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was the difference in our public lives versus our private selves. So you have a situation here where you have a husband, as you said, who's trying to be supportive of his spouse who is running for office, and yet the husband sort of disagrees politically with everything that the platform of the candidate. Curious, how, and that's what your book's about, sort of wrestling with this dilemma. Wondering if you could expound a little bit on that.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, sort of thematically, there's politics in the book, but it's not a book about politics. It's really a book about marriage,
Yes.
and about that sort of public-private divide. Because, like, thematically, that's what actually kind of brings the book together. Because it switches perspectives between the guy whose husband who's running for office, the woman who's a stay-at-home mom, and the woman who's a workaholic, basically. And the guy who's running actually doesn't get a perspective, because, and that was sort of a deliberate decision. And I actually toyed with giving him one and then I took it back. But because thematically, he's not going through this same thing that the other three are. Like the three of them are, they have this vision of themselves, and one day they look around and the world sees them in a completely different way, right? And like that's something that's really, well, first of all, like the guy who's running for office, that's not happening for him, right? Because he's made this decision and this is what he wants to do and how he wants to be seen, right? But for the other three, like that's a pretty universal feeling, right? I feel like most of us at some point in life will kind of wake up and look around and not recognize how the world sees you. I mean, it can happen at sort of like big moments, like when you're kind of first trying to, you graduate from college, you're trying to be an adult out in the world for the first time, or when you retire, or when you hit middle age, like, and you kind of think, did I come all this way just for this, right? Like there's a lot of that I think we all deal with. And it can be really like, can make people really nuts, right? Because it's really hard. Like, people want to be understood. That's a very fundamental desire, right? And then, but when you kind of get to this place where you're not, and, the role that you like, what, this kind of public role you have is so different from how you would want the world to know you and how you think you know yourself. And it's all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I find that really, really interesting, and it takes so many different forms, and it happens to all of us. And so I thought that was sort of the idea that kind of kept me interested. I mean, I kind of had these four characters when I started, and that idea, and just sort of wound it up and kind of let it go and see what happened. So
Yeah, yeah. So I'm probably going to get myself in trouble here, but
go
speaking,
for it.
there we go, exactly, famous last words. But so, I think that from a Democratic point of view, I think a lot of Democrats see Republicans as a party that is, you know, not totally embracing of the LGBTQ community. Okay, and wondering, I think that's something that Gabe struggled with, where you had a situation where he is where Ethan is seeking the endorsement of someone who is clearly anti-LGBTQ in his policy positions, whether it's a gender affirming care for trans people or banning books with LGBTQ topics, and so I think that you know, I think it's interesting the idea. I guess what am I trying to say? I don't know. I guess it must be. It was. I felt like it was difficult for Ethan to be a gay Republican, and I think it was difficult for Gabe to. I think he was sort of lumped in, sort of like guilt by association, where people assumed that maybe he had the same positions as his spouse did, whether it was on immigration or LGBTQ or other things. Just your thoughts on that whole word salad right there.
No, totally. And I should just say up front that because I'm a reporter at the New York Times as my day job, I'm not allowed to talk about my own personal politics. It's a newsroom wide, actually company wide rule. That sort of the point of it is that like if I, Elizabeth Harris, say something about abortion, for example, one way or the other, it makes life a lot more difficult for the people who actually cover the issue, even though I don't, because it would become so and so of the New York Times believes this about abortion. Everyone who works there believes this about abortion. The New York Times says this about abortion. So it sort of, they would kind of muddy, it would, kind of it muddy things for the news people basically who are covering it. So there's a blanket rule that I'm not allowed to talk about it. That said, I can still answer your question. Um, so I think, like, yes, absolutely. I think that that is a thing, that's sort of one of Gabe's central struggles is sort of being lumped in with the views of his husband. And as you said, like it's immigration, it's a whole lot of things, but definitely sort of LGBTQ issues is one of them. And there is that assumption, first of all, that, I guess I should say though that, like queer Republicans do exist, right? And I talked to some of them also as part of my research. And, so they are out there. But if you're not, right, if you're a queer liberal person, queer Democrat, whatever it is, like to be sort of thrown in that bucket and assumed, and to have all these things assumed about you is definitely something that causes him a lot of stress and anxiety. I will definitely agree with you on that. But I mean, I think these characters kind of just arrived in a sense. Like, I had this idea that I wanted to explore, and I had these characters, and everyone in the book is queer in some way. Like, these two men are married, the two women, this is a bit of a spoiler, but it's very early, they have an affair. And, even the woman who's married to a man who has an affair with a woman, like, she's not having a crisis about this. Like, she used to date women, like, she kind of could have ended up with a man or a woman, and she just ended up with a man. And so that was sort of something I really wanted to explore, and just sort of the different ways, kind of the different ways people have a queer identity and how they think about it, but also have it not be a story about kind of people coming to grips with it. Like everyone here is an adult, everyone here knows it, and no one is upset about it for themselves, including the Republican. And yeah, and so it wasn't like I didn't like set out exactly to be like I wasn't like I want to explore queer Republicans. It was more just like, okay, these people are this is how I see them, and I want everyone to be queer in some regard in this book. So wouldn't it be interesting if this happened? So that was sort of where that came from.
Now, we know that Ethan is running for Congress in New Jersey.
Mhm.
We meet, we know of his political consultants, and we know that he's seeking the endorsement of someone named Brett Cooper. So this Brett Cooper doesn't really exist. It's a fictional, character. So I'm curious, were there ever any thoughts of like naming real life Democrat and Republican modern day politicians? We were instead of fictionalizing everything.
In a very, very early, like one of the first drafts, I kind of toyed around with it with real people. And then I took it out almost immediately for two reasons. The main one is that I didn't want, I didn't want to like I didn't want to write a book like as I mentioned, I didn't want to write a book about politics. I wanted to write a book about marriage. And I felt that if it was about real people, like it would be too much, right? Because, as you mentioned, like hopefully the book is funny and hopefully it's a good read. And I tried to make it a page turner and like all of that stuff. And I felt like if people were kind of watching fictional people deal with the real world in a really direct way, and politicians that every reader is going to have feelings about, like whether it was, the Democrats, the Republicans, whatever, it would change the reading experience a lot. And I think make it kind of much more, like just much more difficult, really. And I wanted it to be, a smooth read that hopefully would people would enjoy, and hopefully they would think about some things. But I didn't want it to feel like medicine. And I think if it was like a politician on either side that really stresses you out, then it would feel like medicine. Um, and then also it would date it. is the other reason. Is I think this is, well, and I guess there's a third reason is I started writing this in late 2021. And like, who knows, right? Like the only thing I have learned from being in journalism for 20 years is that all of my predictions are wrong. And so I didn't want to be like assuming that anyone would or wouldn't be in office in any particular period of time. So it just was better just to have this be like a totally fictional people. And, they're all kind of like, they're not kind of like a shadow version of any particular person. They're just made up. So I thought that that would, kind of solve a lot of issues at once. So I tried it and I didn't like it. So I got rid of it.
So for me, some of the most fun and funny scenes from the book involve the children. So Ethan and Gabe have a child. Nicole has two children. And so, I read a lot, and I haven't read a lot of books with gay parents. So yours does spend a lot of time with family scenes with gay parents. Was this a deliberate choice? And what challenges and opportunities were there?
Totally. Well, let's see. I would say to start with, like, the kids were so much fun to write. I would say if I had to pick one thing, that would probably be it. And I have two kids, and I mean, like, kids are, I would say, well, one thing is they're really hard to write well. And because they're so often like, parenthood is like the most like transformative thing you can do, like for your finances, for your relationships, like for your life, and yet, like in fiction, often kids are these sort of like little accessories that are sort of used to like move the adult plot forward, like, or they're kind of like mini adults. And, I mean, plenty of people do it well, but like it's easy to not get it quite right and have them not really feel like kids and not really feel like individuals. They just feel like kind of amorphous child, right? But like every kid is different, right? And like one of the kids in the book is kind of tough, right? And is like some kids are like have a lot of feelings and need more management from their parents and like they just need more, right? And so I thought it was important to have one of those kids in there and and then there's another kid that's just like exploding ball of energy and sequins, right? I mean like they're just different, right? And it was really fun um trying to do that and also just sort of trying to get it right. And one thing that makes kids such great characters once if you do feel like you get it, is because they're so different from adults. And so they kind of create this different tone in the book and they kind of change things up. And they're also, they surprise you because they just think completely differently than adults do. So they're like a nice, just in terms of structure, they're kind of a nice way to change things up. Um, but yes, absolutely, gay parents. Let's see. I think that was another thing that it wasn't a totally deliberate decision in the beginning. Like these people arrived and I was like, well, of course they will be parents. And I didn't think too much about it until I kind of got probably a draft or two in and was sort of like, oh, like this is kind of unique because I mean I read a lot also and I'm a gay parent. And but off the top of my head, like how many novels can you think of, right? Like any, right? I'm sure they're out there, but like off the top of my head, like it's hard to come up with any. And and so that was really kind of exciting just to be able to sort of think that like here's this opportunity um to, have people get to know some gay parents. And, I would say like inside my own house, for example, like parenthood is the same as it is in anyone else's. Like, you got to get your kids to bed, you have to try and force someone to do their homework and occasionally bathe, like do those kinds of things, right? But like out in the world is sometimes where things are different. Like even in the most like accepting communities and welcoming communities in the country, there's still kind of, you know, people respond and react in different ways. And like, I live in New York City and usually it's completely fine, but like, things come up, right? And so I wanted to show kind of both sides of that, like in the book. Um, Gabe at one point is standing at the photocopy machine. He's a high school teacher and he's making some Xeroxes of his of worksheets for his students. And he's sort of chatting with a coworker who he doesn't particularly like. And the coworker's about to have a baby. And so he's chatting with him. He says, hey, did you guys adopt or did you have a surrogate and do IVF? Like, can you imagine asking one of your straight colleagues that? Like, excuse me, are you infertile? Like, you don't even do that, right? but when you're sort of a gay parent interacting in the world, like that comes up. And so I thought that that was a great opportunity, it seemed to me, to show kind of both how the same it is as it is for everyone else, but also like where it's different. Um, and so it was like an interesting challenge kind of writing the kid part because it was both this like, kind of unique opportunity um to write about gay parenthood, but also this like incredible, this very like prosaic thing of trying to write the kids kind of at the same time.
Yeah, I like that scene at the photocopier, and Gabe ran away without collecting
Right.
all his photocopies. We've all been there. um, so speaking of the kids, though, one thing that I took away from this book, and I knew going in, but this really hit home, was the fact that when somebody runs for office, it's not just them running for office; it's really their entire family that's put in the spotlight. And can you speak to that a bit?
Oh, sure. I mean, I do not cover politics. I did many, many years ago briefly. But as an observer, like for sure, right? Like I think that's like I mean, personally, God, can you imagine? That sounds terrible. I'm so happy my wife has no interest. I mean, because really, like you are, you become like the whole family is the story. The whole family is, to varying degrees of legitimacy and different extents. Like the whole family is fair game to a degree. Like, who are you? Who is your spouse? What are their values? What do they believe in? Like those are legitimate questions. Like when it gets people's kids, no. But like, the sort of the looking at the spouse, like they're an adult and they've decided to support you. So who are they, right? So I think that sounds really unpleasant. But also, there are people who love it, right? And who like want to be in it with you and like, and want to be, they want their spouse to, they want them to win, not just because they love them, but because they want them to win, right? But that is not the story here. And I think part of, part of that is like, this is, Gabe, who's the Democrat, he's not in the weeds of this campaign at all. There's very little in this book that's in the weeds of any, there's like one campaign event basically. Like it's not, and it's a party, but then we're not at rallies and we're not like picking apart strategy. Like that sort of thing is not what the book is interested in, and it's not what Gabe is interested in. And since it's through his perspective, it's really just sort of what this decision his spouse has made does to him, and or sort of does to him personally in his relationships, and sort of where, and also his own kind of moral quandary about like what can he support, how far can he go, like, does he need to draw a line at some point publicly and about what, and that kind of thing.
Sure, sure. Um, Minor spoiler, but I'll ask it. So Ethan and Gabe get pets. Are the pets symbolic of anything? Am I over reading this? Like what does the is the snake just a snake?
I love this question because I love the kids and the pets are like my favorite thing. There's this kind of common conception, to slight tangent to answer your question. There's this common idea that like a debut novel is going to be like a memoir, just basically a memoir. And this one is very much not. Like I can count on one hand the number of things that are stolen from life, and everything else is like just truly something I came upon while typing, right? But the pets are real. Fang was the snake that in the book belongs to a 5-year-old. I forget how old my friend's kid was, but Fang was indeed his snake. And then this is also a bit of a spoiler. I apologize, world, but he escapes. Fang also escaped. So, and then he was replaced by a leopard gecko. So that is. I just thought it was just so funny because Fang, who's this very fancy snake, escaped into into the suburbs basically. And I'm just like picturing this snake that like looks like a giant candy cane, just like slithering around like next to someone's golden retriever or something. And so that one I just enjoyed, and I thought, you know what, I was trying to be pretty strict with myself about not taking things from life, but that one I was like, Fang will live forever. So.
And did the dropping of the crickets really happen? Is that pulled from real
No,
life?
no, that was my own. That's mine.
Gotcha, gotcha.
But it could.
Absolutely. So I
Hmm.
actually wanted to ask you about real life inspiration and Kate. I was curious,
Mhm.
how much of Elizabeth Harris
Oh,
is
sure.
in Kate, and it seems like not a whole heck of a lot. But can you?
Really not totally. So Kate is the journalist. And so when I started writing this book, it was the end of 2021. And had a full-time job, had a very busy job. I had two very young kids. And so to be totally frank, a lot of decisions in this book were made because I didn't have time to do a lot of research. So there were a few things that I could research. I felt like I had to research, right? Like I had to talk to people who I didn't agree with politically. I had to talk to people who didn't agree with their spouses politically. Like I had to do some stuff like that, right? But I sort of pictured this person as a workaholic, and I was like, what profession do I know the most about? My wife is a doctor, and I am a journalist. So those are my choices. And so I picked the one I knew the most about because I felt like I could just do it without doing a lot of research. Um, but yeah, no, other than that, really not much, or not really anything, I think. Because, like, I mean, even the paper, like, there are some shades of like, it's not the New York Times, though. Like, I did that very deliberately. I tried to make it sort of there's a little flavor of the New York Times, but there's a little flavor of the Wall Street Journal, and there's a little flavor of the Washington Post, and they're all kind of mixed together into just sort of one big daily, essentially. But I love the New York Times, and I love my job, and Kate does not love her job, and there are problems with the place where she works that are very different than the place where I work. Um, and let's see. Yeah, I guess that's it. But it was, and also, she's a workaholic, and that's sort of the job is her life, and she's had a very different career than I have. Like she's a foreign correspondent at a certain point. She's covering politics. Like I have these are not no. So, but yeah, so that's I was lazy and short on time, and so I didn't do research on some of these things. That's also why the book was put in like New York and New Jersey, because I know New York and New Jersey very, very well. The ages of the kids were, I had kids. I had a kid who was 5 when I started writing this book, and both of the kids are like 5 or 6 in the book. And there was an older kid, and I had to do a lot of research talking to friends with older kids to get the kid right. And so I was like, I can do that for one kid, only one. So yeah, so those were my cheats.
Well, no, I think it makes sense given where you went with the book to have the occupation that Kate had, and
Yeah, it
I,
worked
I
out.
I was waiting for those. I was waiting for those. And obviously Kate was talking to Ethan, and Gabe throughout the book. But I was waiting for the storylines to converge, and they finally did. But we won't go there. We won't talk about spoilers. I did want to bring up a couple of things that were like very minor, but just kind
Sure.
of fascinate me. Okay, so you talked about, so Kate with her newspaper experience, that storyline talked about obituaries and
Mm.
how newspapers will write celebrity obituaries while the celebrity is still alive. Wondering if you, and I guess like just recently, when Jimmy Carter passed away, it was noted that Jimmy Carter actually outlived the person who wrote his obituary. Just curious if you can talk a bit about celebrity obituaries from what you know.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've never worked for the obituaries department, but I have written a fair amount of them. I mean, you know, not compared to someone who does it all day, but kind of every one of it at certain points you do them. And yeah, so the reason you do them in advance is because if it's a celebrity, if it's like a person who's had like a really long, significant, complex life, if it's, things like that, like if it's Jimmy Carter, if it's the Pope, if it's a great artist, or anything like that, like if it's somebody you want to do those in advance, because otherwise you're going to have like 4 hours to get this entire person's life reported and synthesized and understood and written. And like you can do it, and you can fill it as long as it needs to be, but it'll be so much better if you can spend weeks or months, or chip away at it over years, um talking to everyone they know, reading all the books. I mean, the people who even, there was a guy who's a reporter who covers the South, and he didn't write the obituary, but I think he posted on Instagram or something about all the research he did to write the kind of end of days sorts of stories for Jimmy Carter. I think he read like, God knows how many books. He talked to Jimmy Carter and his wife multiple times, talked to everyone in their life. Like it allows you to really get a rich sense of who a person is. But it's weird also. The ones in advance are really strange. Like I've written one for a very famous writer who is still very much alive. And it's, it's weird in a way to be sort of right, kind of making these pronouncements on a life. Also because then you have to keep updating it actually, because they sort of tend to do it. I don't know, again, I don't work for the department, so I don't know if there are hard and fast rules, but like they called me when somebody kind of entered their late 70s, basically. And I think, if people are in ill health or, any other number of things, like they just want to be prepared. So this author who I think is now 80, who I've written about, somewhere like that, for the rest of her life, I have to sort of babysit this obituary. And like if she writes a book or if she does something, significant in any way that should be noted in the obituary, I'm going to have to update it. And so there are people who all they do is write advanced obituaries. And so they have this like enormous list of sort of people they have to just watch forever. Um, but yeah, and then sometimes obituary writers die, and then you have to, and somebody else kind of gets assigned to like finish it off and kind of get it over the finish line. But yeah, it's a funny thing. I remember when I was a clerk, which is sort of it's like a researcher basically. I was a clerk at the Times 20 years ago or something. And I worked in the editorial department, and they also used to do kind of advanced obituary editorials. And they had one for Castro. And they had it in three different lengths because at that point, like there were three editorials on a page, and things had to be very, very precise in terms of how many of the word count. And so if there was big news on the day, like they could only have kind of a shorter one, a longer one, whatever. So there were at least two nights I remember when they're like, wait, Castro's dead. We have to put it in. Oh, wait, Castro's not dead. We have to take it back out. I'm like that kind of thing. So it was that was my introduction to obituaries, but
Yeah,
now he did.
there you go. Something
Hmm.
else that you briefly mentioned in the book are book bans. And, well, first of all, I did appreciate you had a couple of library references, and the one about libertarians meeting at a library I thought was funny. So that was a
Thank
good
you.
one. Yeah, but so book banning though, more serious topic. So I know sort of outside of this book, you've written many articles about book banning. I did read the one a couple months ago about deselection or weeding that happens in libraries. And I know, I'm sure I've read others articles that you've written about book bans. Can you talk briefly about where we are today in America when it comes to book bans?
Well, I will say my one caveat about this is I'm actually on book leave right now writing another book, so I'm not paying the day-to-day attention to it that I usually do. I've been off for a couple months now. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think sort of broadly speaking, this is something I'm sure you know all this, but for those watching at home, there have been book challenges forever, right? Like maybe like a parent might have questions about something their kid is reading or something like that, and they go talk to the librarian, they fill out a form, or they say they have problems with it. It's a conversation, that's usually the end of it. But in the last couple of years, it's become this very organized, really, really like turbocharged thing. There were kind of Google Docs and things like that with lists of books being shared all around the country. And so people would go into libraries and they would challenge not just like one book they were concerned about for their kid, they would challenge 75 books they hadn't even read. And people would be doing this all over the place. And so you would see these just huge lists of books being challenged, and they would be similar all over the place, which was sort of one of the first signs of like, like what's happening here, right? And some of this wasn't just sort of people being concerned on Facebook. Like there was a lot of sort of concerted activism behind this, and like particular groups that sort of made this their cause and sort of tried to make it they built websites to explain to people how to challenge books in their library. They they kind of made these lists very prominent. They tried to move it forward. Then it moves to the state level, because traditionally this is a very local issue. It's moved to the state level, and there have been some state laws that either make it easier to pull books off the shelves, or they kind of make or they try and or they say certain kinds of books aren't allowed. things like that. So it's really transformed in the last 5 years from what it ever was here before. So yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see where it goes now. So
Yep. No, that's a good summary. And I think, unfortunately, things are going to get worse before they get better on this topic. So, Elizabeth, I also wanted to ask you, so, so you cover books and the publishing industry for the New York Times, like I just talked about there, and so you knew more than most when it comes to being a debut author. Okay, so I'm curious, how did your experience at the Times as the primary, book reporter? How did that inform the writing of this book and the promotion of this book?
first, I'll just say there are two of us who cover books, and the other woman is fantastic. So,
My
but we
apologies.
both don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But I just, karmically, I felt like I had to give her a shout out. But yes, all of your points all absolutely stand. Is I've been covering books for, I guess it was 4.5 years or something like that by the time mine came out. And I would say the things. In some ways, I tried to forget everything I knew while I was writing it because I think one of the things that's really struck me as I've learned more and more about sort of the publishing business and writing books is just how hard it is to get people just to know a book exists. Like everyone's, like book sales are doing generally well, right? And people are definitely reading, but there's this sort of narrowing of what people are reading. Like, everyone's reading the same 100 books, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of other books that are published in a given year, just no one even knows about because there's so much less coverage of books than there used to be. A lot of people buy their books online where everyone's fed the same algorithm, or I mean, the algorithm's a little bit different, but they're still fed the same most popular books, right, through the algorithm. And it's really daunting, right? Just like trying to get word out. And so when I was writing this, I was sort of trying to think. I mean, well, even another point is just how hard it is also to get a book sold to a publisher in the first place, because there are so many, really great books that just don't never get published because you just don't find the right person at the right time, and the book doesn't get bought. Um, so when I sat down to write this, I was just sort of I'd always wanted to write fiction. And I had this idea and I had some time because it was sort of late in the pandemic. And my wife, who's a doctor, always went to work. She works in a hospital, but my kids were back in school full time, but I still wasn't expected to go to the office every day. So I sort of thought, well, I have this an hour and a half I would normally spend on the train. So let me just see if I can do something with it. And I sat down, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to write the top of the book. So when you write a newspaper article, the first couple paragraphs are called the top. So I was like, I'm just going to write the top of the book. I'm not going to worry about where it's going. I'm not going to worry about if anyone in the world is ever going to read it, is ever going to buy it. Just going to write the top and see how it goes. So I wrote the book, and the file was called Book Top until I sold it. Um, but it was, so that was, I think that really helped to just sort of assume that no one's ever going to buy it. And then if nothing ever happens with it, at least I'll have had a really good time writing it and I'll have tried, right? And I did. I had a great time. I loved it. It became like a complete addiction. And which was the only way I was able to accomplish it with all of the other things that I was trying to do, like not get fired, for example, and still have my children know who I am. These were important goals. So let's see. I forget where I was going with that, but yeah, there we go.
Well, I
Did I
think
answer your question?
sort of, yeah. So the question was, how did your experience at the Times inform you when you were writing the book and when you were promoting the book?
Oh, yes. Oh, and then the promoting stuff, I would say. So yeah, I guess in terms of like knowing the book market, I guess I am somebody, a very successful author once said to me that you have to sell the first 10,000 copies yourself, and then after that, hopefully it takes on a life of its own. Almost no books sell 10,000 copies for those watching at home. Like if you hit 5,000, that's really good. Like fewer, I think it's something like there were some numbers a couple years ago that 95% of books don't sell 5,000 copies. But I think that's just sort of, I'm trying to just be as like, as out there as I can, but also trying to do things that I think are fun. Like there are I am not a master of TikTok, right? Like that's like I love that people are, and I think it's wonderful that people are so excited about books on TikTok, but like I don't know, like I don't know. I would not know where to begin. But like doing things like talking to book clubs, like any book club that invites me, I'm totally happy to come join your book club because like I'm just happy to talk to book people about books, right? Happy to do stuff like this. I'm happy to do like an Instagram live with a bookstagram, like a book influencer or whatever, because those are really fun. They're just people who love books, right? So I'm trying to both be, do things and be a good partner to my publisher, but also trying to pick things that would be fun for me also, because I think I would be better also at the like I don't think it will I think it would be a waste of my time and everyone else's to try and like make myself go viral on TikTok because I mean, look at this background. This is not no. So yeah, so that would be my answer.
Elizabeth, what would what genre or genres? How would you classify your book?
That's tricky. I mean, I guess I would just say contemporary fiction. Is that a cop out? Because it doesn't really, because it's not a romance and it's not a political book and it's not like, it's sort of like, how would you put a book about marriage that is funny? Is that be its own, hopefully, category? People, yeah. What do you think? You read it.
No, I know. Well, that's why I asked the question. It definitely it's a genre bending book. You're in a lot of different genres. I'm gonna have to think about my own. I'm gonna have to think about the answer to my own question a little bit more. Um, Comedy. I don't know. Is that certainly a film
I'll
genre?
take
Can
it.
that be a book genre? I'd say
Yes,
comedy.
let's say yes.
Yeah, yeah. So we hosted great talks last week with Grady Hendrix and with Fiona Davis, and they were both talking about, and their books were on the New York Times bestsellers lists. I think Grady was number two, and Fiona was number six for print hardcover fiction, and
Great.
but they were both bemoaning the point that right now America is obsessed with dragons. That there are these fantasy books that remain super popular and on the New York Times bestsellers lists for weeks and weeks and months. And I'm just curious, from your perspective as one of the two top book reporters at the New York Times, what trends are you seeing in the publishing industry right now?
I mean, that's the big one. You stole it. It's dragons, right? It's romantasy, really, right? It's like these sort of, books that kind of smush together romance and fantasy. And this is sort of what we were talking about before, right? With this sort of funneling effect that things are having where, these books are selling. I think the most recent Rebecca Yarros book sold like 2.7 million copies in like a day, if you include pre-orders. Like that's insane. Like no book sells 2 million copies at all. And so, that goes back to the point that like book sales are quite healthy, but everyone's reading that book. And before it was the Romanticides, it was Colleen Hoover, and she had, four books on the top 10 New York Times bestseller list for like months, right? And so it's that same thing where it does it gets harder. It's harder for people to find new books, and it's harder for people to, 'cause I mean, the best way probably now to do it is either, social media, like a lot of people do find new books on social media, but also that also funnels people because, kind of a book takes off on TikTok or an author takes off on TikTok, like both Colleen Hoover and some of the Dragon books, some of the Romantasy books are like huge TikTok darlings, and that's where they got their start, right? So that too is the funnel, right? So like unless you go into your library or you go into your local bookstore, like those are really the ways that people find different books now. Um, and and so that's like, and not everybody does that though. I wish they would, obviously. Here I am. But yeah, that's what I would say.
So more questions about your book. So this will come from the audience. So audience, if you have any questions, now is the time to get them into the chat, get them into the Q&A. And I certainly have a list of questions I still want to ask, but I want to get to yours first. So Rosemary asks, can you talk about the connection between the plot and the title of your book? Did you get to choose the title, Elizabeth?
Yes, well, I did, but I don't think a publisher would ever want you to have a title you hated, though. So I think they want you to be happy. But it was sold under a different title that I never liked, which was my idea. I just never liked it. And so it was sort of getting towards the end of the editing process, and I had my wife read it again. I think this is the third time she read it, and I was like, just read it for a title. I need a title. And she came up with it. So hats off to my wife. And the way it's somebody says it in the book, and somebody is talking about like, how can you sleep at night? Thinking these sorts of things, right? Or like, how do you, how do you sleep at night? I don't, whatever, kind of making these decisions for your family, essentially. And that was sort of, and that really struck me as like, okay, like that's it. Like, how do you, like, how to sleep at night? It's sort of people, you know, making like how far, how do I put this? I think what I was saying before, right, about the idea that like how far can you go to either support someone you love at the expense of your own values, or how far can you go for yourself at the expense of your family, are sort of the two things that our different characters are grappling with in the book. And so it's a lot about kind of guilt and how far you can go, basically. So thank you to my wife. I thought it was a very good title.
And I know it's cliche, but you mentioned it in the book that that the piece of advice is to never go to bed angry. I think, and
Right.
you had a situation where one of the two couples started to go to bed angry. So
Yep.
John wants to know, back to the talk about the kids. John says some kids talk like kids in books, while others talk like small adults, or how we imagine kids talk. How well do you think the kids in your book talk like real kids?
Well, I certainly hope they talk like real kids. You might want to ask a reader more than me, but I really, really tried. And that was one of the reasons I made them ages that I was familiar with, is because I mean, my kids are 6 and 9 now. Like I have no idea how a 13-year-old really talks, right? And it took a lot of, and at the time I had a 5-year-old and I had a lot of friends. I knew a lot of his friends who were 5-year-old, like 5-year-old, I had it. And there was a 9-year-old in the book at the time, and so I just did spending a lot of time talking to people who had 9-year-olds hanging out, kind of watching their 9-year-olds. I also had people read the 9-year-old dialogue who had 9-year-olds very specifically to be like, does this sound real, or does this reaction sound real, and that kind of stuff. So I really tried, because I agree, because it bothers me personally, when kids talk like mini adults, because I'm just like, no. Like, and I mean, we all forget really quickly. Like I forget, I can barely remember how to change a diaper, right? Like the moment the phase is gone, it's out of your mind, right? So I don't fault people for it, but that is my own pet peeve, is like they are just not miniature adults, and they don't think that way, and they don't talk that way. And and it's great. And it also, and I think you can really feel it when it's not right. So hopefully it's right.
So we'll start to wind down with maybe a handful of more questions. So, if How to Sleep at Night gets made into a movie, Elizabeth, who plays Ethan? Who plays Gabe? Who plays Nicole?
Ooh.
Who plays Kate?
I have no idea. That's a really interesting. I've never thought about it, because like when the audiobook, and you listen to the audiobook, right? And I that was an interesting process. Like, so what they did is they send, at least for me, they sent me 5 people, and they were like, rank them in order of your favorites, and if there's someone you don't like any of them, we'll get you someone else, basically. But luckily, my first choice was someone who said yes, and it was great, and I think she's awesome. But I tried to listen to it the first time. Like I listened to a little sample of it, like right when the book came out, and I was like, wait a minute, that's not what they sound like, because I can hear them in my own head, right? Like I have these very distinct voices in my head, and it was very weird hearing. And I have since listened to it, and I think she does like a fantastic job. But it was a funny moment. So I would imagine it must be the same, like watching these characters that you can absolutely see and feel and hear. And then, like, I mean, God, I would be so lucky, like, whatever, like Nicole Kidman, like, wanders across the screen, and you're like, that's weird. So I've never pictured it, but, who knows?
So, Elizabeth, what writing advice would you give to aspiring writers? You're now a published author. You've been being the book reporter for the New York Times for the past nearly 5 years. What advice would you offer to first time authors?
Well, what worked for me was, to sort of try and sit down and try and write a book, was something that was very much from my journalism. So I've been covering books for about 5 years, but I've been a reporter at the Times for more than 15 years now. So it's been a long time. And I've written a lot of stories. And, reporters don't have the luxury of inspiration or of time, right? Like something needs to be written the moment it needs to be written and fast and now, right? And so that's like a muscle. And the more you do it, the more you're able to just sit down and sort of spit out whatever is in your head. Um, and so what I did was I told myself I'm just going to spit out a draft and I'm just going to get it down because once it's down, you can see what's missing and you can hear what sounds false. And like it's much easier to fix it once you've got the whole thing in front of you. So, that was something I was able to do because I'm used to just sort of sitting down and doing it, which helped me in that, like, I had 45 minutes here, I had an hour there, like, I could just sit down and do it. But anyone can do the thing where you just sit down and get a draft out, right? I mean, not anyone, but that I think is very generalized advice, right? Where, like, if you have a goal, I was talking to an aspiring novelist the other day, worked a bookstore, and we were talking about, if you just like give yourself a goal of like you have an hour or whatever it is you can find every day, and you just put down the words, like you just write words, and you don't really worry about where it's going, and you don't really worry about how pretty it is, and you don't go back and obsess over it. Like I'm writing a book right in a second book now that's unrelated to the first one, and I'm just writing, and I don't even go back and reread a scene. I just go on to the next one because I just, at this point, the point is just to like get the idea down and see if the structure works and see if the characters are real yet, that kind of thing. So that would be my suggestion.
So it sounds like you're more of a pantser than a plotter. Have you been asked that question before?
I have. I'm a little bit of
Yep.
both. I'm more of a pantser though. I'm more of a pantser, but I have like a general, like the first book, very much a pantser. The second book was sold on a synopsis. So I have like a general gist of where it's going, but also if you sell a book on a synopsis, like they're not going to hold you to it. Like if they like what comes in, they're happy, they don't care. But I do have like kind of a general gist of where I'm going, but I do just sort of sit down but I mean, the other thing is though also like, as I'm doing it by the seat of my pants, it's not always while I'm actually writing. Like a lot of it's sort of like cooking in the back of my head all the time, right? So like you're doing dishes and you're thinking like, oh, what would that person do? And I wonder if they would really hate that, and thinking about kind of what comes next. And so then by the time you sit down to write it, it's sort of half cooked and then you can start. So that's how I try and do it.
So my guess is you probably can't give us too much, but can you talk about this mysterious second book you're working on? I know you said you've been taking a
Sure.
break from the Times to write it. Anything you can give us? And beyond that, when do you think you'll be returning to the Times?
Yes, totally. So the quick elevator pitch for it is the second book is about a relationship between two women that lasts about 60 years, and through them we can see how much being gay in America has changed in one lifetime. So,
Oh,
so that's what that one's about.
wow,
Um, and I should be back this summer. So that's
great.
nice.
All right, Elizabeth. Excellent. So, Elizabeth, where can folks watching live and those watching the recording, where can we find out more about you?
It's a great question. I guess I should build a website or something, shouldn't I? But I don't have one. I'm
Okay.
on Instagram as Lizzie A. Harris. If you Google me, my New York Times information shows up, and you can send me an email through. You can like click on my little face on any article I've ever written, and emails will go to me, and I do check them. And if you're on social media, feel free to DM me in whatever capacity, and I'll get back to you. And if you have a book club, I am happy to come. I really love book clubs. I am a very enthusiastic member of a book club.
Excellent. So, Elizabeth, I'm sort of a rookie interviewer. I'm typically the behind the scenes tech person. Was there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or is there anything you'd like to add? Anything you want to leave the audience with before we wrap things up?
You did a great job. I'm very impressed. If this is something you don't usually do, you did a fabulous job.
Well, thank you. I'll take the compliments. So, folks, let's give Elizabeth a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation or a great conversation. See, I'm a rookie. There I go. So, folks, look for for those watching live. Look for an email from me later tonight with a link to the recording and information about some other upcoming virtual programs, as well as a link to Wellesley Books to purchase a copy of Elizabeth's book. And then when you exit the Zoom in a moment, please take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey that should hopefully pop up if I did things correctly. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for a wonderful evening. I enjoyed the conversation, and I really enjoyed your book. If I had it, I would hold it up and listen to it on my phone, but it was an excellent book. I really enjoyed it. There we go, folks. Looking good, Elizabeth. I like the cover, too, by the way. We didn't really talk about the cover. Nice cover. So, folks, thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Robert. Take care.